What is cultural apologetics? How should we engage the culture in which we live with the gospel of Jesus, and how should we go about defending its truthfulness? Today on the show, I bring on Dr. Paul Gould, who has a PhD in philosophy from Purdue University, as well as a master's in the philosophy of religion and ethics from Talbot School of Theology, which is at Biola University, of course. And again, we discuss his book, Cultural Apologetics, which you can find in the description below, the link to the Amazon page, so you can get that and soak it in. It's a great book. Highly recommend it. If you enjoy the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, and as always, if you want to support Help Me Believe, follow the Patreon link in the description below labeled Support Help Me Believe and become a patron. Thanks so much, guys, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and I'm excited to introduce my special guest to you. He is he is the author of the recent book, Cultural Apologetics. His name is Dr. Paul Gould. Dr. Gould, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today, Haden?
Man, I'm doing good, and I'm excited to have you on. I've had some of your colleagues on, and both actually recommended you to me, but I was already kind of familiar with who you are as I went to the seminary that you used to teach at, and I got a hold of the Cultural Apologetics book, and man, I'm excited to have you on.
Awesome. Well, sorry you had to hang in there with my colleagues, but I'm sure that...
No, they were great. They're nice guys as well. But for the audience that may not be familiar with who you are, I thought it might be helpful if you gave us a brief introduction.
Yeah, okay. So, my name is Paul Gould again, and let's see. So I've been married over 25 years, actually, but got married really young, obviously. And we've got 4 children, ages 20 down to 12. So one in college, one a senior in high school, one that just got his driver's license, and one that's in middle school. So our lives are full.
All right.
There, yeah. Let's see. I like to run, although my knees are bad, and so currently I'm barely walking. I am walking, but I keep hurting my knees. But I like to think that I like to run. And I like to read, obviously, philosophy and theology and things like that, and apologetics. And then, let's see. I was going to tell you. And this year I'm a visiting scholar. Actually, I was telling you, Hayden, beforehand, but I travel Monday through Thursday. I'm in Chicago this year, and I'm working on the official title is Neo-Aristotelian Accounts of Divine Creative Activity. But basically, I'm just really interested in the doctrine of creation, and I'm interested in how to make sense of the concrete material world that is the universe. And then my other work has been on the abstract world, and then I eventually want to put them together so that we can make sense of a metaphysics of creation. That's kind of what I'm working on. But we can talk more about it. But that's kind of my life right now, is hop on a plane Monday and going home on Thursday.
Yeah. So you mentioned Aristotelian, and so I am a student at Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is broadly subscribes to a Thomistic philosophy, which of course would be Aristotelian as well. Are you in the same camp, or are you around there, or
I'm around there. I have friends that teach at Southern where you are, and I never think that what they say, they just know way too much about Aquinas. I don't know enough about Aquinas to know if they like what I have to say. But yes, broadly in the Aristotelian tradition, the Thomistic tradition, especially when it comes to understanding concrete material reality, that is the universe. I'm actually a Platonist when it comes to the other realm.
That's what I was getting from what you were mentioning just a second ago.
An oddball there, but that's yes.
So a concrete Aristotelian and an abstract Platonist. Is that a good way?
Something like that. Yep, something like that.
Well, tell us a bit about your testimony and kind of lead up to how did you get interested in apologetics?
Yeah, so I grew up in the church, the Lutheran church, but pretty much a nominal upbringing where I just missed the gospel throughout elementary school and high school. And then I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and within the first couple of weeks, they have a fairly active, it was called Campus Crusade for Christ, or CRU at the time, fairly active organization. And so 2 guys came knocking on my door that freshman year. And I was basically freaked out because they shared the gospel in a really succinct way with me. Actually, for the first time, understood, it's a personal thing. There's a decision that I have to make and things like that. But there were basically 2 things that after they had shared that kind of stuck with me. One was this question: why are these people that are so normal looking, because I had this stereotype, so into something that's so abnormal, namely God? But then really the second question was the one that, as they say today, was the pebble in my shoe. What if they're right? And so that's what began this sort of journey. It took me another year of I actually went to an apologetics class as a non-believer. I didn't know that was not normal.
Yeah.
But a friend who was down there in the same dorm said, hey, we've got this class and we're exploring evidence. And so I went to that and was just blown away with, every week the professor would bring a stack of books and it would be on the deity of Christ or the evidence for the resurrection or does God exist? And I can just remember being blown away. And so basically about a year into this, so the summer after my freshman year, I was actually reading my Bible at the time, and I was reading Revelation, and finally it was sometime that summer I said, you know what? I know this stuff is true, and I was just trying to wait till I don't know, had my wild college time or something, and I just realized it was a moral decision that I needed to bend my knee. And so that's when I became a Christian and kind of jumped all in and got back that sophomore year and began being discipled and kind of really went for it in my faith. So that's kind of how it all began.
Oh, that's really cool. So I like to ask this question because I think it's a lot of people experience it, and it's a good question that I think needs to be discussed more. But was there ever a time whenever you had some serious doubts about the Christian faith, and if so, how did you go about handling that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I certainly took that year to wrestle as a freshman in college, where something that I had grown up with but just never given much thought to, whether or not the gospel was true. I really pressed that question of truth that first year, that freshman year. And so I looked at the evidence for the resurrection, and I looked at the evidence for God's existence, looked at the evidence for the deity of Christ, all those things, and kind of resolved in my mind, oh my gosh, there's tons of evidence here. So when I became a Christian then, it was a pretty thorough. I had spent a lot of time wrestling with the intellectual stuff. And so I would say my only doubts since then would be things like this. Whenever there's a loss or a difficult time, it's more existential. Like, God, do you care for me? God, do you care for the deep desires of my heart? Do you care for, the things that I care about? So an analog of the problem of suffering and the problem of divine hiddenness, but not one that has caused me to wonder in disbelief, but one that has just caused me to doubt in my own heart. Wait a minute, does God care for me? And things like that. So those have been probably the things. And I think actually, since you asked this, I think it's rooted in growing up, not experiencing genuine, unconditional love in my life. And so, even into my Christian experience, bringing those doubts with me. So the intellectual stuff has been, and I'm kind of wired that way, so I've always been pushing intellectually. But for me, it's almost like I need to bring my experiential knowledge. I know God fully loves me and God is fully present. But, pushing back against the empiricist, naturalistic world that tells us that God isn't here and God doesn't care and the universe is immense and we're just on a tiny dot in the middle of nowhere, But no, wait a minute. Okay, I have good reasons to think God exists. I have good reasons to think that God loves me, and I can walk in faith in that. So that's
no. I think that's a very important distinction, and I guess I hadn't expressed it as succinctly as you did there. But it kind of seems like whenever you have you have the knowledge, like, I know God exists, but sometimes it's hard to believe He exists right here, right now, with me in the midst of suffering and doubt and things like that. But it's good to have that intellectual knowledge that whenever you have emotional doubts like that, you can fall back upon and say, well, even though I feel this way, hold on a second, I know, whatever, the Kalam cosmological argument or some intellectual argument for the existence of God, and then of course the resurrection. And so I know this is true, and so my intellectual knowledge can perhaps help me in this emotional situation. Would you say that's pretty fair?
Yeah. I've even had, so recently, we experienced a loss in my family, and I really had to go back to, okay, what do we believe about God? What's our theology say? And then I kind of mentally checked through it. God is active in my life, and God cares for me, and so on. And so as you mentally walk through that, it just allows me to lean into God in my doubt, as opposed to sort of run. And I've always struck in Matthew 28, right as Jesus is getting ready to give the Great Commission there, it's so interesting. All the disciples come to the mountain there,
Mhm.
and then it says, but they worshipped him, but some of them doubted.
Some of them doubted.
Yeah, and the word is they vacillated.
Okay.
But the point is they were there.
Yeah.
And so that's always a good reminder. Okay, I can have my doubts, but my doubts don't push me away from God. I move into God in my doubts. And so, yeah, just mentally going through that helps to keep that head heart thing connected. So, yeah, well said, well summarized, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, that verse has always struck me as so odd now that you bring it up. Like, what were they doubting? It's hard for me to put my,
Right.
he's like right there.
Right. Well, yeah, they doubted. What about us? I mean, of
Yeah,
course,
exactly.
we struggle,
Yeah.
right?
No.
Yeah.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit here. That was a wonderful conversation, but we're actually here to talk about the book, Cultural Apologetics. Of course, we can talk about whatever we want. But again, the book's called Cultural Apologetics. You'll find a link in the description. I highly recommend it to the audience. But tell us kind of where the idea came from and kind of what the purpose was here and maybe what's unique about the book.
Yeah. So, okay. So, after graduation from college, worked for a couple years, and then both my wife and I, who had become Christians through Cru, so our lives had been drastically changed as college students. And so we had a real heart for college students. And so we eventually joined staff with Cru and began to work with college students ourselves as campus ministers. And so it was there that I began to wrestle almost immediately as a campus minister with this question: how does the gospel get a fair hearing? I mean, truth is on our side. I've found the truth. We know the truth, but yet in the academy, in the classroom, Christianity is maligned and misunderstood and mocked. And so there's that disconnect. And so for the last 2 decades, I've been wrestling with that question: how does the gospel get a fair hearing in our culture? Fast forward, now I'm, through a seminary degree and a PhD in philosophy. Now I'm teaching at a seminary. And one of the classes I was asked to teach is, well, I actually suggested it and then assigned myself to it. But anyway, it was a class called Cultural Apologetics. And this was about 5-6 years ago. And of course, as any educator would do, when you don't know the topic that you're supposed to teach on, you Google it.
Yeah.
Not really. That's what I did. And this was, 5-6 years ago. And I Googled the word, what is cultural apologetics? And basically, I found very little. I mean, there's been a lot since then. So what I did, again, the fundamental question: how do we have a conversation with our culture so that the gospel gets a fair hearing? But what I ended up doing then at the seminary was every year I'd select 7 books that I was interested in, because it's all about me. Not really, just joking, but it's like 7 books that I'm interested in on the gospel, on apologetics, on culture, and then I would teach through them. And then I would swap them out with 7 new books. And about after 4 or 5 times of teaching this course, I began to have my own view. Okay, this is what I mean by cultural apologetics. And I figured I should probably write a book on it because it was something that I'm deeply passionate about, this question of helping to show others that Christianity is true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be. So that's kind of the genesis of why. Sure. So I read it for my kids. I read it for my kids' kids. I read it for the sake of the gospel, both now and in the future. Yeah, that's the backstory.
Well, it is a wonderful book, so thank you for writing it and doing the hard work that it takes to write a book like that, so I appreciate that. Now, you said you finally came to a definition of cultural apologetics, so I'd like for you to share with us what that definition is and specifically how it differs from plain old apologetics, or, okay. I don't know, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. That's good. So typically, when we define apologetics, as I know Haden, it would be something like giving a rational defense of the gospel or something like that. And of course, cultural apologetics is part of that stream. But what I do is I actually claim, well, in the book, I claim a new lane for cultural apologetics. Yeah. And so here's the definition that I arrived at, and then I'll tell you why I give it a new lane. So the definition, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like working to reestablish the Christian voice, the Christian conscience, and the Christian imagination so that the gospel will be seen as true and satisfying. Yeah. In other words, so that the gospel will be seen as true and good and beautiful. Yeah. And so there's the working definition. And within that, there's this idea that we are part of culture and that we're shaped by culture. So as human beings, we make culture, and then the culture makes us.
Sure.
And not only that, that we're part of culture as fully embodied human beings that are rational, to be sure, but we're way more than that, right? We have minds. People call us emotional animals, narratival animals, imaginative animals, moral animals. And so taking all that together, what I wanted to do was carve out a lane where we are concerned with what does it mean to live in a culture, and how does the gospel get a fair hearing in culture, and how does even the culture work? And so I talk about how the cultural apologist works both upstream and downstream, or globally and locally. Upstream, we work at the level of all the culture shaping institutions of our world, because that's really where culture changes. And so if we want the gospel to get a fair hearing, we have to be present in those culture shaping institutions. And in the book, I pick out three. One with respect to truth, which is the university, one with respect to beauty, which is the arts, and then one with respect to goodness, which is the city, which includes a whole host of things. And then so we're concerned about the upstream, but we're also concerned about the downstream, or the local. How is the gospel being received at the level of individual lives or groups of individuals? And so that's what's going on, where some people distinguish like rational apologetics or moral apologetics or imaginative apologetics. I take all of those and kind of enfold them into a view that I think is consistent with what it means to be human, and humans that are part of the culture that they make and therefore are shaped by. So that's a little bit about what it is, I guess.
Yeah. It seems like cultural apologetics, as you define it, takes, or at least could work with, whatever flavor of apologetics that you want, whether it be evidential, classical, presuppositional, moral, rational, whatever. It's like, here's your definition of cultural apologetics, and all those things can fall under it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm pretty eclectic that way, and it is meant intentionally to, hey, look, God has made us in all these ways, and we have all these resources available. And so I'm basically trying to broaden. I mean, I think we're so good historically at what we might call rational apologetics,
Sure.
Giving arguments for the faith to show that it's reasonable, of course. And of course, rightly so, because Christianity has been maligned as irrational for, I don't know, a while. But here's the thing. There's so many other objections that we've got to address too, that have to go to the goodness of Christianity and the beauty of it as well. Are Christians hypocrites? Is Christianity really good for the world? What about the God of the Old Testament? Is he a moral monster? And on and on and on. Does Christianity really satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart? All these are questions that we have that aren't strictly rational. Of course, they're partly, they involve our minds, but they're broader than that. And so really, it's not an either or, it's a both and everything. But yeah, you're right. Neutral with respect to evidential versus classical versus that.
Yeah, and I'm all for the rational and the evidential approach to apologetics, forming syllogisms and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I'm still young, but when I was even younger, that's all I really wanted to talk about. Like, because it's surprising whenever you grow up, nominally Christian or something, you go, holy crap, it's actually true, and you can, prove it. You can define prove however you want, but prove it. And so you get pretty obsessed with that. I certainly did, and I know a lot of young apologists continue it too as well. But the more you stick around, and I'm obviously no veteran by any means, but I've kind of stuck with it over these last 5 years or whatever, it didn't take long for me to realize it needs something more than this. Just as a few recent examples, I had a dialogue with an atheist who asked me, even if Christianity is true, so what? And I thought, what do you mean, so what? Like, that's the point. The point is, it's true. But what he really meant was, he said, why would I believe it? But I didn't climb out on it. It's like, well, you should believe it because it's true. But what he meant was, why would I subscribe to it? Why would I follow it? Why would I let it affect me and change my life, even if it was true? And I thought, I was pretty unprepared to answer that question. And another one I've gotten is, even if Jesus rose from the dead, so what? I'm like, what do you mean, so what? But again, it's missing something there. Or at least that's what that highlights for me. These modern or recent objections that I get, they don't have to do with syllogisms. It's hard for me to even define what it is that's missing. But I think your book is aiming at that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so it's really interesting. So I use the language, and I assume we'll probably get there, but I use the language that we live in a disenchanted age in
Yeah.
the book, trying to assess and understand what is our culture like right now. But what's so interesting is that man can live as if God doesn't exist, right? We can live everything within the so-called immanent frame of this world. The intelligentsia tell us there's nothing beyond this world. All of our lives can make sense in reference to this world. And so what happens, and I've noticed this too, it's interesting that you picked up on this, but I can remember, and I share in the book about how when I was teaching philosophy as a PhD student at Purdue, I would see progress. We'd go through the classic arguments for God, right?
Yeah.
Give all the arguments, cosmological, teleological, ontological, moral. We'd even, do the problem of evil and the divine hiddenness, and everyone would almost to a T move from either agnosticism or unbelief, if they were there, to some form of belief. And I'm like, awesome, progress, philosophy can help. But they do exactly what you said. They just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, cool, God exists. Woo! Right? Let's go party.
Which is bizarre to me. But
Yeah,
yeah.
it's just like there's the disconnect between, okay, the furniture of our world just got way more complex, and the so what question. And so a cultural apologetics takes all that and connects it to the deep longings of the heart, And so part of what we're doing in cultural apologetics is awakening that longing for truth and goodness and beauty, which of course has its source in Christ. And so it's just pushing beyond that so what question that you get and I get so often too,
Yeah.
because we live in a disenchanted world, and helping people because we need help to connect the dots.
Yeah, so I want to get to that. I got a follow-up question for you on that. But first, let me say thank you to our patron supporters. Thanks so much for your generosity. It's because of your generosity that I get to put out free material like this, as well as other material that aims to spread and to defend the truthfulness of Christianity. And if you believe in that mission and you want to support Help Me Believe, you can do so by following the Patreon link below and become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. With your support, you'll get access to early release, live Q&A, chapter and book reveals on those self-published books I put out. And at the $5 level, you can get access to the bonus segment. Today's bonus segment will be 5 more minutes with Dr. Paul Gould. You won't want to miss that. Again, just follow the Patreon link in the description below, labeled support. Help Me Believe. Again, thanks so much, guys, for your support. And let's get back to Dr. Gould. So I think the problem that we are addressing could be, to give it a name, a word would be apathetic. Don't you think? And I get this a lot. I say this and not as like a ooh go Haden, but some of my best friends, and they've just been my friends since high school and stuff like that. They are atheists, and those are just my best friends. But anyway, they're more or less, if I ask them, does God exist? The response is almost like, who cares? You know what I mean? It doesn't bother. If he exists, he clearly doesn't want anything to do with me or something like that. Or, like we were just discussing earlier, if Jesus rose from the dead, so what? I've never seen him. He did that a long time ago. It doesn't have any effect on me today. How do we move people? Because whenever I, became convinced that God really does exist and the gospel isn't just a good, bedtime story, but it really did happen. I mean, it just radically changed me almost immediately. My desires immediately changed. And of course, I believe that had something to do with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Obviously, not everything to do with it, excuse me. But, how do we move people past apathy? Because I don't know how to motivate people that well, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right. That we suffer as a culture in a disenchanted world with sloth, which is the spiritual equivalent of apathy. It's actually one of the 7 deadly sins, so that's not good. But in a disenchanted world, there's more of that, right? It's just, the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, I don't care about God, or the apatheist who doesn't care about the question of God, or, Alex Rosenberg, the chair of the Duke philosophy department, who wrote a book in 2011, An Atheist Guide to Reality. In the first couple pages, he says, we've already settled the God question. We don't care about the God question. Let's just figure out how to live in an atheistic universe. And of course, by the time you get to the end, the answer is take drugs if you can't handle it, like Prozac and things. But yeah, so we live in this world. So I think the first thing, so let me just say 2 things here. Sure. One thing that I've noticed, a lot of times I'll go and speak around the university campuses around the country. And a lot of times people are asking me to give an argument for the problem of against the problem of evil, or some argument for God, or whatever, to build a case for Christianity.
Sure.
And typically, I used to just go and give the standard philosophical, engage the reasons, engage the syllogisms. I'm a philosopher, of course. I love all those things, still do. But what I've started to do lately is to do all that, but to couch it. But I say this. I say, will you just for 20 minutes consider the possibility that God is actually better than you think? And that for 20 minutes, will you consider the possibility that God is that Jesus Christ satisfies every longing of the human heart? And what I'm really trying to do there is change their posture from a posture of closed-mindedness to a posture of openness to the very possibility of God. Because in our apathy, I think we feel as if we're already justified in our non-belief. So that's the first thing I would say is I've noticed that in doing that and just challenging them to be genuinely open, people are a little more awake to these deep longings of the heart. The second thing, though, I'd want to say in terms of how to help people make that connect is we do, and I argue for this in the book, that we want to shock people into engaging with reality by awakening longings. And so sometimes that awakening or that initial stirring will come from arguments. That's obviously God has made us as rational animals who seek and long for truth. But there's so much more. So I talk about how God has given us a conscience that is on a quest for goodness. And we can simply ask him questions like, what is it that you want? And the answer is usually, I want to be happy. But then the question is, well, we all want to be happy, but yet it remains so elusive. So what's going on there? Just explore that. Or the one that I think is so strategic in our culture today is the longing for beauty that we have, and that God has given us an imagination which is on a quest for beauty. So shocking them into engagement with reality by talking about stories in our culture that we all resonate with. Because my thesis is, and I unpack this in the book, is that the things that we resonate in the stories that we read or the movies that we watch, I think that the things that most resonate with the deep longings of the human heart are just those things that actually connect with the gospel message. And so we can use as one person would put it, the aesthetic currency of our age to shock people into awakening these longings that they have ultimately for God that they just might not be aware of.
Yeah, I want to get to the beauty question, but first I want to ask you about this disenchantment, so a word that you've used a couple times here in the interview, but also one that I found often used in the book. What do you mean by disenchanted, and how did the world become so disenchanted today?
Yeah, so the primary question to get at the answer of what I mean by disenchantment is, what is our culture's dominant way of perceiving? And the answer is disenchantment. And so what that means is that people describe the world as ordinary or mundane or everyday.
Yeah.
But that's actually not the way the world is, right? It's deeply mysterious. It's beautiful, sacred. And so disenchanted way of perceiving is failure to see the world in its proper light as gift or things like that. And so we live in a world where it's been emptied of her magic. No one sees it for what it is. And so the word I use then, and it's not my word, it's a word that comes from Max Weber, and it's been employed in Charles Taylor's seminal work, A Secular Age, and a lot of people are picking up on the term, but that's basically what it means. Did you ask, okay, then how did we get here?
Yeah, sure. How do we become, hold on, because you said something that was pretty interesting, and I was just having weird philosophical thoughts the other day about something along the same lines, which I often do. But I'm just sitting here, I don't know what I was doing. I may have been laying in bed. But I was thinking about how in fantasy and fiction novels and narratives, we read about mystical creatures and stuff that are so crazy and whatnot. And we think, wow, that would be weird to live in a world like that. And then I thought, yeah, but what the heck is a rhinoceros, or what the heck is a giraffe and stuff like that? It's like we live in a very weird world, and there's so much magic in this world that it is just bizarre to me that we do really just walk around like this is totally normal. The fact that we exist isn't normal. The fact that we exist is crazy.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I'm going to let you speak on it, but I think there's something to do with this disenchantment, at least of how we got here, is that, maybe it has something to do with the fact that we think the fact that we can explain a lot of the mystery through mechanistic scientific explanations somehow takes the magic out of it or something like that. I don't know, but go ahead. How did we get here?
Yeah, how did we get here? So if you go back 500 years, this is one of the really interesting things from Charles Taylor, for example, his work, A Secular Age. He says, if you go back 500 years and just some normal, I don't know, person living on a plantation or whatever, everybody basically held to three views. And the three things that pretty much everybody believed were, number one, the natural world functions as a sign for the supernatural world. So the language is that the natural world is semiotic, but it just means that it's a sign. It points to the divine. That's the first thing that everybody believes. Secondly, there is this widespread idea that the earthly kingdoms reflected the kingdom of God. And then number three, there was a widespread belief that the universe was enchanted. In other words, they held to a sacramental view of the world. So what happened between, the year 1500 and today? Well, there's a political story really quickly. There had been religious wars for a long time up till then, and there was going to continue to be religious wars through the revolutions of France and so on. But so negatively, there was this attempt in Europe to get rid of Christendom and Christianity. Positively, politically now, there was a desire with the scientific revolution, to see man conquer and understand and tame nature. So that's a political explanation. There is a philosophical story, and I give one in the book. I won't bore you unless you want me to, but it has to do with shifting ideas between things like, and I'll just list them, but I can go deeper if you'd like, but things like going from realism to nominalism, going from a more organic view of the world to a mechanistic picture of the world, and then the elevation of a theory of knowledge or an epistemology called empiricism. So there were philosophical shifts, but I guess the way that's most helpful for me, not just politically or in terms of the philosophy, but as spiritually, I would say our descent into disenchantment was a two-step descent, and you just need to think of Romans 1. It began with suppressing the truth about God, and then from there, everything else emptied from the world. And so C.S. Lewis has this great little essay called The Empty Universe, where he says basically, we began to empty the world. The minute we began to think about the world, suppressing the truth about God, we emptied it of all her magic. And so now, it's just little atoms in the void, and we measure it with charm and spin and mass, and that's about it. There's nothing beautiful about that story. And so I think that's maybe, that's one way to understand it, just Romans 1 as well.
Yeah, I don't know, I have confused thoughts about this because, obviously the scientific revolution and being able to explain things mechanistically is very helpful and useful, and it's been it seems inherently good, or at least it can be good.
Yeah.
But when you and I start talking about magic and enchantment, I can almost hear, whoever, Richard Dawkins, and it doesn't have to be someone, like him, but other atheists going, yeah, that's the point. We want to take the magic out. We want to take the enchantment out because this sort of stuff gets in the way of us progressing through this scientific method. How do you kind of respond to that? Because it's almost like, I don't know what to say to that, because to me it's not mutually exclusive, I guess, is the point. Is that I'm not saying I don't mean magic, and I think in the same way that you do if you're objecting like someone like Richard Dawkins or somebody might. Is that the point? Kind of how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's see where to begin. Yeah, obviously some things had to go, right? The ancient experience of the world is vastly different than the modern experience. We don't believe that behind every tree there's a dryad, and behind every river there's a river god, right? So some of that needed to go. But what happened is they threw out everything in the scientific revolution. And here's the things that were thrown out that didn't need to go were belief in teleology or purpose, design, and were essences or natures. So the Aristotelian piece, there's this idea that somehow substantial forms or essences kept us from science because they're occult. You can't, through empiricism, you can't touch them and things like this. And so, Hume and all these people threw them out. Well, they threw out the baby with the bathwater on that. And so what happens is you not only empty the world of the dryads and the nymphs, which it rightly should have been emptied of, but you emptied it of meaning, you emptied it of essences, you emptied it of purpose, you emptied it of teleology and all these things that I think what's so interesting today, we speak of the Aristotelian comeback in philosophy and
Yeah.
science, especially with quantum mechanics. I'm actually I think I mentioned this. I'm doing this research fellowship here at Trinity this year, and I'm reading all the literature that is talking about the Aristotelian comeback, where man, they threw out some stuff that didn't need to go. And so
Yeah.
I think you get everything you want in the scientific revolution, but you didn't need to throw out things like purpose, order, design, and meaning. And that stuff got thrown out too, eventually.
So you probably are reading some of his work, I guess, right now in your studies. But I had to pull this quote up because I was just reading it the other day. It is Dr. Edward Fazer. Uh,
I'm reading his book right now. Go ahead.
which one is it? Aristotle's Revenge.
Yep.
Yeah, I haven't read that one yet. So I'm
Yep.
looking back on his, maybe one of his first big works, which was The Last Superstition, which says, is a quote from the book. I got the ebook. It's on location 1080. It says, abandoning Aristotelianism, as the founders of modern philosophy did, was the single greatest mistake ever made in the entire history of Western thought. And he goes
Whoa.
on to say, well, that was a big claim, but I really mean it. And so I've just gotten to that part of that book. I never read that book before. But yeah, the substantial forms and things like that seems to have been a huge mistake.
Yeah, and it's not like, I mean, so I'm under, not all Christians are under this persuasion, but I happen to be under the persuasion that we need essences, we need natures to do work for
Yeah.
us. I think that it secures objective meaning when it comes to arguing for truth claims. I think in our theology, we want natures. For example, we want to be able to say that Jesus took on a human nature such that it's sufficient that he died in our place and so on.
Yeah.
So I think it does explanatory work in philosophy and in science, but we also want it for the things that we hold dear, like our theology and our objectivity of truth and things like that. So yeah, that's a pretty bold claim that how he puts it.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
he
sympathetic to that.
yeah, he tends to do that. But
Yeah,
yeah, he's a great writer,
that's
though.
good
I love
writer.
reading his stuff. Um, so I think the answer to the question was basically, how you summed it up, which was we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. Sure, there was some superstition in there from the ancients and things like that, but there's also a lot of wisdom that got thrown out with modern empiricism and scientism and mechanism and nominalism, to use the words out of your book. Um, but okay, now I want to get to the beauty question. So in the book, you talk about beauty, and I think you guys did this in the Apologetics book that I talked to Dr. Travis Dickinson about as well. But the idea is that beauty is not merely in the eye of the beholder, but it actually is an objective feature of reality. How can you justify such a claim?
I would say just as there are physical facts, and I see your microphone there, and it's the fact of the matter that you have a microphone there, and you're drinking water.
Maybe.
There are
No, I'm just
also
kidding. Go ahead.
moral facts in the world, and they're part of the furniture of the world. Like honesty is a virtue, and torturing babies for fun is wrong. Just as there are physical facts and moral facts, I would argue there are aesthetic facts as well.
Okay.
That there's objective beauty in humans, there's objective beauty in everyday beauty, even in a well-cut lawn. There's sacred beauty, so there's degrees of beauty and things like that, but it's part of the furniture of the world. And so I would say beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is beheld by the eye, is how I would like to say it. So there is a subjective part, and the subjective part is that beauty is beheld by a perceiver.
Yeah.
But there's the objective part that is part of the furniture of the world. It exists whether or not we are. It's still a fact that a sunset is beautiful.
Yeah.
Of course, it won't be beheld if there were no perceivers, but it would still be objectively beautiful or something like that. Does that help? Or
Yeah. Well, it helps. I'd like for it to be drawn out a little bit more, but let me
Yeah.
see if I can give kind of a definition, just working off what you're saying and now confirming that you've got this Aristotelian background a little bit. It seems that we say something is beautiful when that thing is nearing perfection of what it is. So when the sun rises, that's perfective of the sun's nature. That's what it does. That's its purpose. Whenever you see a neatly cut lawn, there's something perfective of that or something. And I'm not wording it perfectly here. I'm just the student. You're the teacher. So what do you mean by whenever we say that a thing is beautiful? What does it mean for a thing to be beautiful?
Well, see, okay, good. So I like that you're pressing that because you're forcing me to make distinctions, which is helpful because that helps us be better thinkers. And so you already made a distinction between beauty itself and beautiful things, right? And
Okay.
so now you're pressing how is that thing over there
Yeah, I guess
beautiful?
that really is my question. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. No, that's great because that's really helpful. So first we make a distinction between beauty itself and beautiful things. And the first claim was there is objective beauty, but now the question is, okay, fine. How do we know, or something like that? And I really like what Aquinas says on this, actually, in the Summa. We're looking for criteria to discern beautiful things, and there's been like 8 or 9 criteria that are proposed in the literature. I actually like what Aquinas says, though, and I could get it to you, and if you want to pass it on to your listeners, I can tell
Sure.
you where the quote is. But let me just summarize it right now, where he basically says beautiful things have these 3 features in them. Number 1, there's a kind of wholeness or perfection. Number 2, there's a right proportionality or harmony. And then number 3, there's a kind of radiance. And what's so interesting about that, if you walk through each one, so wholeness, when things are whole, it's just as it ought to be. It's that perfection that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And that produces in us this kind of peace, right? When things are as they ought to be. And then proportionality, everything fits together just the way it's supposed to be. And that produces a kind of joy that we experience in community. And then radiance, like what does he mean? Beautiful things have a kind of radiance. Well, if you think about it, beauty communicates. And that's the kind of meaning behind what Aquinas is saying there. That some people talk about how beauty is kind of like a personal communication, where it either evokes this awakening of awe and wonder, or as it did for Judas, for example, in the Gospels, the other response was horror and actually killing the only 2 people that you love, yourself and your Savior. And so that's what beauty does, right? It awakens within us this longing. So it's a kind of calling. So I think that those are criteria that are just as good as any, the ones that Aquinas proposes:
Yeah.
wholeness, perfection, and then a kind of awakening or calling to
And so,
us.
do you come to this definition, or does Aquinas come to this definition, if you know, by observing things that pretty much everybody agrees are beautiful, and then kind of abstracting some principles out from that, or maybe what might be helpful is to take something that we all agree is beautiful, and then kind of say, why is it beautiful? And if I just put you on the spot, we can edit this out. But take an example if you can of something that is beautiful, and then kind of say why, objectively, why it's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be one way to go about it, right? Is to all of us know without having criteria. We know beauty when we see it,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
that's what I mean. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So interesting. So we're going to push into a little more philosophy. Since you went there, there's this question in epistemology or in the philosophical discussion of knowledge, like how do you know things in general?
yeah.
And there's a philosopher named Roderick Chisholm. Have you read any Chisholm yet?
No, no, not
Okay.
yet. I'll
So,
write him
so
down though.
write it down. So it's called The Problem of the Criterion. It's one of the most important essays, I think, in epistemology ever. So push, JT or whatever, to make you read it or something.
That is my teacher. I'm studying epistemology right now. Yeah.
Well, then tell him where's Chisholm? Where's The Problem of the Criterion? Tell him Paul said so. Anyway, so Chisholm has us. He asks us, how can we know? Do we first have a criteria, and then we can define what knowledge is, or do we just know it? Do we know the things that we know, and then we develop our criteria? Chisholm argues that no, we don't have a criteria for knowledge first. We just have knowledge,
Yeah.
right? I just know things, and then we take the clear cases and develop a criteria of knowledge.
Sure.
And I think we could apply that to what Aquinas is doing. We take clear cases of beauty, and from that we could just do like an inductive inference. Hey, what do these things all have in common? And so Aquinas proposed those 3. Actually, the text that in the Summa where I think he's talking about this, if I remember, and I would have to go back and look, but I think he's talking about the Trinity, actually.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that's where he kind of, as a side comment, throws out this criteria for beautiful things. But I think that most people would just kind of set up look at beautiful things and say, what are the features that they have in common? And that's why I said there's about 8 things that are debated.
Sure.
Symmetry, simplicity, are 2 other ones that are often thrown out there. And then now there's a movement that against symmetry, and it's asymmetry, is the beautiful thing. And so, I mean, some of these are cultural that's all I got.
Yeah,
So
no, that's good. Let's move on a little bit here to how would you say that the gospel is beautiful? You know, the other day I was on an atheist YouTube channel, got invited on, and it was basically getting at the point that being beaten and crucified on a cross wasn't that beautiful. That's not what he said, but that was kind of underlying his question that he was putting to me. How can a story like that be beautiful?
well, he's right that part is tragedy,
Right.
right? But of course, the tragedy of the cross is answered with the divine comedy of the resurrection. And so if you take the whole story and its narrative, it is beautiful. I mean, since we were talking about it, let's take Aquinas' three criteria. The gospel story, it's of all the competing stories out there, the question that every person needs to ask themselves is which of these stories understands you? And I would argue that the gospel story understands the deepest longings of the human heart, and it calls us to a life of meaning and purpose and drama, right? And so it calls us in a way that I don't think any other story does. There's nothing missing from it. I mean, Alvin Plantinga, who you probably know the name, Christian philosopher, important philosopher, he talks about not only, Anselm talked about God as the greatest conceivable being, and the idea was that God's not in fact the greatest being. I mean, he is the greatest being, but he's more than that. He's the greatest conceivable being. You couldn't even imagine a being better. Well, Plantinga argues similarly that the gospel story is not just the greatest story ever told, but it's the greatest possible story that you could ever tell. Why? Because it has incarnation and atonement. So you could apply that to Aquinas' criteria for beauty and say, well, nothing's left out. It's the greatest possible story. And of course, it's a whole story, right? Because it begins with man's tragedy, but then it moves to the divine comedy. The man's tragedy is sin, but the divine comedy, the unforeseen, is that God became man. And then it's the unending fairy story, right? The happy ending that never ends. It's complete. It's whole. And so, yeah, I don't know. That seems to me like
No, that's a great answer.
Story. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah. Yeah. Okay. So moving beyond kind of the beauty and the aesthetic value, you do actually give some rational arguments in the book, and one of them that isn't one that I've studied much, but I think it actually ties back in with Plantinga, is the argument from reason to God. Could you kind of briefly, lay out the argument from reason?
Yeah, so one of the things I was doing in the book was walking and taking up my readers on the plank of reason, the plank of the conscience, and the plank of the imagination to show this bridge that we can build from our Athens to Jesus. And on the plank of reason, I was looking at reason itself, like not using reason, but the faculty, the power that we have to reason. And there's an argument that you can give from reason to God, and it basically goes, at least the way you can cash it out in a number of ways, but the way I did it in the book was basically this: hey, given theism, it's not really surprising that there would be minds, but given atheism, it's really surprising that minds would have evolved or whatever. Therefore, probably God exists. And the idea is, as C.S. Lewis puts it, and I'm pulling in the book there from C.S. Lewis's chapter 3 in his book Miracles, where he says, I love how he puts it. He basically says, if the world is just matter, like if there's nothing else to this world, how do we it's really hard to get minds from purely matter. But if, as he puts it, capital R, reason is older than matter, well, then you already have minds on the scene, right? You've got capital M mind. And so we wouldn't be surprised that God would bring about lowercase minds and things like that. And so that's basically what I'm doing. And the point is, there's certain features about our mental life, and I list 4 in the book, that are really hard to account for in a strictly materialistic metaphysics. And they would be things like the laws of logic, or the fact that our mental life, it has what's called aboutness or intentionality. No rocks have thoughts about London, but our minds have thoughts about London, and things like that are really hard to account. And of course, philosophers try, right? Naturalistic philosophers try all the time, but I don't think they've had any success. Whereas with theism, we have a real ready explanation for why we have the kind of mental life that we do. And so that's called the argument from reason. And again, I think it's not as well known, but I think it's a pretty persuasive argument. And part of what I wanted to do in the book was highlight some other arguments that aren't as well known, that are just as powerful as the classic arguments that we see all the time.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Dr. Gould. I really appreciate it. I don't want to keep you all night, but we've had a wonderful conversation here thus far, and I've really appreciated it and enjoyed it. And I hope the audience has too. I'm sure they have. But to the audience, if you want to hear the bonus segment, 5 more minutes with Dr. Paul Gould. Again, you can follow the Patreon link in the description below, labeled Support Help Me Believe, and become a supporter if you're not already to watch the bonus segment. But before we get to the bonus segment, Dr. Gould, what would you say to anyone out there who wants to engage the culture effectively with the gospel, as well as present its truthfulness and defend its rationality, that sort of stuff? Maybe some final comments. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say maybe check out my book.
Of course. Again, it's in the description below. Of course.
Yeah, but if I could boil down all of what I'm trying to say in the book. Are you convinced that the gospel is the only story alive, the only story that understands you, the only story in which you can locate your life and find true meaning, true happiness, true purpose, and be correctly related to reality? If you're convinced of that, well, then begin to see the world the way and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And then I would just encourage you to invite others to do the same. So it begins with us. It begins with loving God with all of our being, as Jesus says in Matthew 22, and then inviting others to do the same. So maybe that'd be a good summary of what I would hope.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again so much for joining me, and we'll have to do it again sometime. But thank you so much for taking time out of your day to do this.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Haden.
Thanks so much for joining us, guys. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, and of course, if you want to become a supporter of Help Me Believe and get access to the bonus segment to watch 5 more minutes with Dr. Paul Gould, be sure to follow the Patreon link in the description below, labeled Support Help Me Believe, and become a patron. Thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you next time.